Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 6 of our reading of Neptune 1 is Missing. And we're going to go over the copyright information, which should be on your screen right now. It's like copyright information is copyright 1969 by Hugh Walters, and it's the first edition, all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portions thereof in any form. So, anyways, in the last part, the Neptune 1 crew basically opened all the vents, abandoned the ship because the fuel compartment was overheating. So that vented all the heat out, and now they have started repairs. But it looks pretty bad because they don't have the ability or the ability to repair it completely. So they're going to have to be selective about what they repair. Anyways, and they have started repairs. And we will continue from there. I don't remember exactly where I was, but okay. Oh, here we are. Ugh, what would I give for a steak and chips, sighed Tony, as they finished their meal. Though the food was quite appetizing, it wasn't like sitting down at a table and using a knife and fork on a piled-up plate. Though none of them expected ever to see Earth again, the crew talked together as if nothing was more certain. Each described his favorite dish and valiantly kept up the fiction that all was well. They felt reluctant to resume their hopeless task. It was pleasanter to dwell in this world of make-believe where the mind shut out the grim reality that lay ahead. It was only when the torch goes out that they bestirred themselves to return to the mass of scorched cables. From one of the storage lockers, Tony produced a coil of white-colored cable. He explained that this was the color code for repairs, and he would have to mark it to give the circuit identity. They had a supply of colored markers, markers like crayons, with which they could put rings of various colors on the white cable. A blue marker on the white insulation was sufficient to indicate the nature of this particular piece of wire. The new cable with its occasional blue ring, was threaded through the twisted mass of burnt wiring. It looked like a long white worm that had sprung up from the ashes of its predecessors, and it took many hours to do the job to Tony's satisfaction. Long before their task was finished, all but one of the torches had faded out. Now the last one, too, showed signs of imminent exhaustion. It would be touch and go as to whether Tony would be able to make the last vital connection before they were plunged into eternal darkness when further work would be impossible. Chris, Maury, and Serge watched Tony anxiously, though they knew that his success would not affect their ultimate fate. Survival for as long as possible had become a point of honor. To get the ship's lights working again would not only help them in other tasks, it would also give a tremendous boost to their morale. Somehow it seemed they could fight on better if they could see each other rather than end their day in the isolation of complete darkness. I think that does it. I think that's done it, Tony gasped at last. You can throw the switch now, Chris. Tony had been working under tremendous strain in a most awkward position. Sweat was pouring from his face, and as he eased his aching body from the wall cavity in which he made the final connection. Each of the dim lights of the dying even in the dim light of the dying torch showed the perspiration streaming down his cheeks. The feeble light moved and settled on a panel of switches that then a hand came into the barely illuminated circle and felt for a switch. Everyone watched and waited. With a quick movement, Chris depressed the switch. The next instant, their morale rose sharply, for the cabin was once again flooded with light from the bulkhead lamps. Tired though he was, Tony joined the others in a strange, weightless war dance to celebrate this tiny victory against the appalling catastrophe that had befallen them. It was some time before they had calmed down. Perhaps unconsciously, they had used the restoration of light as an opportunity to work off some of the tension they felt. For the most stoic astronaut, trained as he is to meet death fearlessly, feels a quiver beneath him when he knows that his end is imminent. Like a good leader, and because he felt it himself, Chris knew all this so quite firmly, he insisted that they all take to their couches to get some sleep. In their highly excited state, he knew they would need some help. He gave his crew a sleeping tablet each, took one himself, and then tightened the straps on his couch. Within minutes, the cabin was still and silent, but for the heavy breathing of the sleeping young men. Excuse me. When next Chris opened his eyes, he felt a delicious sense of lassitude. Even though he soon remembered the happenings of the past, he had no wish to move from his comfortable couch. There was no real need to, he told himself, so he wouldn't mind if he spent the few hours or days that he had left in this delightful relaxed fashion. None of his companions was stirring, so he closed his eyes once more and tried to rid his mind of all thought. He soon found that this was impossible. In spite of himself, his brain began to ponder the situation that they were in. They were not the first astronauts to be lost in space, and they wouldn't be the last. This wasn't what was bothering him so much. Chris thought with a slight frown. It was what had caused this disaster, this waste of so much skill and effort. The light in the cabin glowed cheerfully. At least here was something they had achieved, Chris thought as he fixed his gaze on the shining source. If they hadn't, by now they would be groping about in total darkness without the prospect of seeing light again. The only glimmer of illumination they would get would be from the distant stars and the small sun through the viewing post. Not enough to see each other, let alone to carry out repairs. Was it any use making further repairs? It would be impossible to undo all the damage that had been caused to the spaceship's electrical system. Even to trace and replace a few of the simplest circuits would take many hundreds of man-hours. They would never get Neptune 1 to function as before. The expedition was a write-off, and so was the crew. But of course, he mustn't let these thoughts infect his crew. They were all intelligent enough to understand the situation, and their courage would not fail. Even so, it would be easier to carry on if they had some specific task to do. Chris pondered what their next objective should be. Naturally, he would like to get the radio working once more. It would be a great comfort to hear human voices other than their own. He'd no doubt that Control had already written them off as dead, and Sir George Whiskers, Billy Gillanders, and all their friends at the Cape would be getting used to the idea of their loss. Would it be kind to shock them by speaking as if from the dead? It wasn't as if things could be put right. Their fate couldn't be altered, but only postponed. Then their friends would have to suffer the same grief a second time. Yet Chris knew that it was his duty to report what had happened to his chief, so that any lessons learned could be passed on. If that were done, the Neptune expedition would not have been a complete loss. However, he decided to put off any work on the radio. They would try first to discover the cause of the disaster. There didn't seem much point in contacting Control unless they could pass on some vital information. The disturbance that contact would cause wouldn't be worthwhile unless it was to help the crews who would follow them. Another task was more urgent: to repair the oxygen cycling equipment, because most of their long journey to the Great Planet would have to be under hypothermia. Their oxygen needs would have been greatly reduced, so the supply of bottled fresh gas wasn't great. To a large extent, they depended on the recycling of the cabin's atmosphere through the machine that would restore its purity. And of course, they had lost a lot of oxygen by the combustion of the cables and in opening the airlock to draw out the smoke and heat. If they could get the equipment working once more, it would greatly extend their spell of life and might give them sufficient time to trace the fault that had terminated their hopes so abruptly. So, having made a decision, Chris relaxed once more and indeed must have dozed, for the next thing he knew, Tony was calling to him. "Come on, Chris, breakfast is ready," the mechanic was saying, with rather brittle cheerfulness. Chris released one of the straps and sat up on his couch. He could see that the other three were all awake, and he didn't contradict them when they began teasing him for having slept so long. During the meal, Chris told his crew about their next task. At first, Maury and Tony protested that the radio should be tackled next, but he explained his reasoning, and they had to accept the wisdom of his choice. "How much cable have we, Tony?" Chris asked. "Oh, quite enough for that job. With some left over," Tony said. "We'll have enough just about for the radio as well." "Right. When you've all finished stuffing yourselves, we'll make a start," Chris declared. To strip down and almost completely rebuild the oxygen purification plant was a much greater task than repairing the lights. Working flat out, it took them a day and a half just to uncover and trace all the damaged wiring. Tony performed miracles with his tools, and his companions secretly admired the deft and confident ways he used them, though of course they would never let him know that. Chris had to call a halt and order them all to sleep at the end of their first quote-unquote day. But they eased off of their own accord when the last burnt cable had been removed. While his crew had been concentrating on the first part of their task, Chris had slipped away to check on their oxygen stock. Of course, there was still a vast amount of liquid gas in the huge tanks, but there was no way of utilizing this for breathing. The liquid oxygen was for the chemical motor to breathe, quote unquote, and not the crew. The supplies were stored in cylinders under high pressure, and with the help of the purifying apparatus, they would have had ample. But because of what had happened, their stock had been very much depleted, and Chris could see that the job they were doing had become urgent. Without revealing his disquieting discovery, he returned to assist his crew. By the time all the damaged wiring had been removed, the cabin looked like a junkyard. It couldn't be dumped out into space until the air pumps were working. It would have meant far too many journeys through the airlock to get rid of all the wiring, and each time some of the precious oxygen would have been lost. It would have been more economical to put on spacesuits, pump out the cabin's atmosphere, open both doors of the airlock, and sweep the debris out into the void. So they must wait until the pumps could transfer the cabin's atmosphere into storage cylinders. An added difficulty was that in a weightless condition, the coils of burnt cable wreathed about like long, thin snakes until Maury undertook to roll them all together and strap them down onto one of the contour couches. The sweating astronauts were frequently entangled in the metal coils. Tony looked anxiously at his rapidly diminishing stocks of new cable. A repair of this magnitude had never been foreseen, and only a minimum amount of spares were carried. However, his main worry was whether the electrical pumps themselves had been damaged. For of those, he carried no replacements. There were two of them, and it was an anxious moment when, many long hours later, he connected up the current. They worked. A major task had been successfully completed. The pumps began forcing the thickening atmosphere through the filters that removed impurities and returning breathable air to the cabin once more. It took only another 2 hours' work to start the exhaust pump, and before they finally collapsed with fatigue, they were able to clear their encumbered cabin by pushing the debris into space. Now, with the lights burning steadily and the atmosphere being renewed, the crew could reflect on their remarkable achievement before they finally sank into an exhausted sleep. How long they slept, none of them knew. The chronometers were not working, and a lack of contact with Earth prevented them from assessing the passage of time. During training, they had been confined to mock cabins without watches, and they had found that the human body's inbuilt clock is not too reliable. Only when they could speak once more with control would they have any idea just where and when and where they were. They all agreed that the next chore must be to repair the radio, although at times Chris had his doubts about the wisdom of this. Would not conversation with their friends at the Cape make their fate harder for all to bear? Chapter 9. Sir George Benson, Mr. Gillians, and Whiskers Greatrex had been silent for a long time. At last Whiskers spoke. "Are you still keeping Neptune 1? Or what is left of it under observation?" he asked. We do take a look periodically," Sir George told him. "We can still pick up the blips the ship on our deep space radar. Of course, we're only picking up a single blip now." "Why is that?" Whiskers inquired. "Oh, simply because after the initial explosion, or whatever it was that broke up the ship, the bits and pieces would drift together again under their slight mutual gravitational attraction." "You don't think it's a good sign that you're only getting a single blip again?" "I'm afraid not," Benson answered heavily. "But we shall continue to track the debris as long as we can. It's a sort of final gesture to a farewell to Chris and the others," said Bill Gillianders. "But we shall soon need the tracking facilities for other probes." While they had been talking, they had heard Mr. Greatrex's answer the telephone. Mrs. Greatrex answered the telephone. Now she interrupted the three friends. "Your office is on the phone, Benny. They want to speak to you urgently," she said. Sir George stood up. He was constantly receiving urgent messages about different space projects, and for this reason he had always to leave a phone number with his office, even if he went to a theater or restaurant, which was rarely enough. He had to tell his staff where they could contact him. He walked out into the hall to answer the telephone, and Billy and Whiskers heard him speaking. Then they were startled to hear the receiver crash. The next instant, Benny rushed into the lounge, all color drained from his face. "We're getting radio signals from Neptune 1, he burst out. There was at least 3 seconds of stunned silence as Billy and Whiskers struggled to absorb this amazing news. Then the floodgates were opened. They inundated Sir George with a torrent of questions. "All I can tell you," he said, "is that 20 minutes ago our station at Singapore picked up the continuous signal from the ship. There's no doubt about it. It's at the correct frequency and from the right direction. I'll have to get back at once." "I'm coming too," Billy shouted. "Why not go in mine?" Whiskers panted. "I can knock a quarter of an hour off the journey compared with this huge thing." "Not on your life," Sir George replied. "I wouldn't trust you to drive us in that old bone shaker. Besides, my car has a radio television, and I must get some messages out." It was arranged that Mr. Gilliander should drive the Bentleys, so allowing Sir George to devote himself to the two-way radio. Whiskers sat forward on the edge of the back seat so that he could hear anything that came over the air. As Billy urged the big car towards London, Sir George spoke into the microphone. Benson calling, HQ, over," he said. There was a slight crackle as the radio replied. "HQ calling, Sir Benson." Over, the voice said. Benson calling HQ, Sir Benson snapped. Now listen, I want all our dishes beamed onto that ship and full recordings made. And get me a plane laid on for the Cape. Over. Very good, sir. We've got a recording of the signals Singapore picked up. Stand by and I'll switch on. Sir George turned up the volume and so that all could hear. From the radio of the speeding car came the whistling noise, and that was the voice of Neptune 1. The three men listened to the weird sound, which at the moment was music to their ears. There was no doubt about it. This was a signal from the radio of Neptune 1. What could it mean? Obviously, the spaceship hadn't been destroyed. Maybe it had only been the two radios that had picked up that had packed up. Oh, wait, sorry. What could it mean? Obviously, the spaceship hadn't been destroyed. Maybe it had only been the two radios that had packed up in spite of the conviction of the experts. But the radar screen had shown that the rocket had disintegrated into a number of pieces. Perhaps Sir George's theory, and the pieces had drifted together again, was also wrong. These and 1,000 more questions sprang into the minds of the three men as they sped towards London. But the big question for all of them was, is the crew alive? The Bentley screeched to a halt outside the red brick building in Theobald's Road. Without even waiting to close the car doors and oblivious to any parking offense, the three men tore into the building and raced to the elevator. Never had it seemed to move so slowly. In 44 seconds flat, they burst into Sir George's office. Still getting it? Benson snapped the question at the small group of men who were waiting. Yes, we're picking it up from several stations now, a bespectacled young man said. Any sign of the data signal? Not yet, sir, but of course we're ready for it if it comes. No voice messages? Sir George just succeeded in keeping the tremor out of his voice. Afraid not, sir. The computer is working out position and velocity at the moment. It should be through at any time now. Right. Now I'm off to Heathrow. That jet is laid on, isn't it? Billy, can you get us to the airport without smashing us up? Excuse me, Sir George, another of the men interrupted. We've got a helicopter waiting for you on the roof. We thought you'd prefer it. Good for you. Sir George flashed a grateful look at his assistants. He must get to Cape Kennedy just as soon as he could. Only there were the full facilities for tracking, communicating with, and controlling Neptune 1. He was about to lead the race up to the roof when a girl came in with a sheet of paper. From the Cape, she said simply. With uncharacteristic brusqueness, Sir George snatched it from her and read it rapidly. 950 million miles and on course, he muttered as he handed back the paper. Come on, what are you all waiting for? The helicopter, its blades turning, was waiting on the flat top of the building. Inside, the pilot was ready, and some short steps led to the interior. Sir George was up there in a bound, followed by Mr. Gilliander. When Whiskers went to follow, the director leaned out of the chopper. Not you, old boy, he said. We'll have to leave you behind. Poor Whiskers stopped halfway up the steps. His jaw dropped, and somehow this made his mustache droop. He looked stunned. Sir George couldn't find it in his heart to leave his old friend behind, knowing how much Chris and the others meant to Whiskers. His face relaxed momentarily. But you haven't got your toothbrush with you, he pointed out. Whiskers was in the helicopter in one bound. He wasn't going to give the director a chance to change his mind again. Hardly had the door been closed before the blades sped up and the craft began to lift and tilt. The rooftops fell away below them, and the map of London started to slide beneath. Within quite a few minutes, the speeding traffic of Western Avenue and the great airport hove in sight. Helicopter circled as the pilot received his instructions from the control tower. He was directed towards a little used part of the port and was soon sinking down to a concrete pad. They landed with only a slight bump. Sir George Billy Gillianders and Whiskers spilled out as a car drew up as it raced them across the tarmac to the waiting Comet. The director felt some pride in the efficiency of his staff. They were streaking over the English coast, not quite 2.5 hours from the time that the Singapore station had received the astounding signal. At least they, oh wait. At least they will know we're still alive, breathed Tony, as he straightened his aching back. Not yet they won't, an equally weary Maury pointed out. Our signal might take some time to reach control. How long, we don't know. They must have given us up for lost, Tony said. Well, aren't we? Serge asked quietly. It's been 26 minutes. We're going to stop it here. We've been reading Neptune Was Missing. It is a book by Hugh Walters. And if you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all that information should be in the description below, along with a link to the Discord server. Anyways, as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.